Good evening and welcome to the May 21st regular meeting of the City of Arcata's Planning Commission. If any member of the public would like to make a comment on any item, there are several ways. While you're on your computer, you can click the raise your hand icon on the right-hand side of your screen. When the public comment period opens, you will be unmuted and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. If you're on your phone, you can also join the meeting and comment by calling the number and meeting ID, all of which are shown at the bottom of the screen. Press *9 to let the clerk know you wish to speak. Again, you will be unmuted and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. And if you're in attendance, you can approach the podium and make your comments. Again, 3 minutes. So this meeting is now officially called to order. Director Loya, can we get a roll call?
Commissioner White?
Here.
Commissioner Tagney?
Here.
Commissioner Figueroa?
Here.
Vice Chair Mayer?
Here.
And Chair Vasaid Elcock?
Here, and at the staff's table, we have David Loya, Director of Community Development, and Joe Mateer, Senior Planner.
And I will note that Commissioners Davies and Barstow are absent.
Okay, let's move on to oral communication. This time is provided for members of the public to address the commission or submit written communications on matters not on this evening's agenda. At the conclusion of all written or oral communications, the commission may respond to statements. However, any request that requires commission actions will be set by the commission for a future agenda or referred to staff. Is there any member of the public who would like to address something that's not on tonight's agenda? I see we have at least one. Please state your name.
Hello, Christian. Afternoon, evening, wherever we're at here. Put my glasses on. I wrote this out and I'll try to make it somewhat clear. I have some questions. I hope the commissioners can help me clarify. In the recent NOP, Notice of Preparation for the General Plan 2045, the proposed gateway plan draft is listed as an element along with all the other elements that are being updated. The entire General Plan 2045 is listed as one project in regards to any CEQA analysis requirements. Anyway, let me move forward here. So Monday I received an email from the city manager, Karen Deemer, that states the gateway draft plan is going to be separated from the General Plan 2045 planning process and lists the gateway with 4 other new specific zoning plans: Gateway, Coastal Plan, Northtown, Spear Avenue, and Valley West. My questions are, is the GAP draft being separated from the General Plan 25? And then why is it listed as an element in the NOP, but the other areas slated for zoning changes are not? And then third, maybe I'm trying to answer my own questions on this one, but should the gateway area plan draft be separated from the General Plan 2045 as it has element status and is such a big project that it should have its own CEQA analysis separate from the General Plan 2045 update? Just trying to figure this out and clarify stuff with all the information that I keep getting, and I don't know, staff or the commissioners maybe can help clue me in of what direction we're headed with this and why things are listed a certain way and others are omitted and all of that stuff. Anyway, that's all I have for this segment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess you can't really hear me. But it's lost in the earring. Oh, well, I'll find it later. Good evening, and I have a multitude of questions, but tonight I'll just kind of, I think, just ask for one to be clarified. So I think there's been a lot of criticism about the community involvement or engagement with the city that the city's put out there. And I think really that transparency is one of the really key elements to gaining the confidence and the public trust. And I saw this quote today, just a little while ago on my way here, but so Warren Buffett said, It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. So I'm really hoping that we can really put more of an effort as a city to community engagement, reach those people that are marginalized and usually don't have a voice in the process, and really put a stronger effort into that. So my question is, I know that there's the timeline for this Gateway Area Plan is grant-driven, and so there's some mention about the ability to extend that time frame. I know it's coming up like January 2023 is what that, deadline was. And so it's been mentioned that it can be extended. I would like to know, how far can that be extended? Like, what is that length that it can be extended? So that's my question, and a little bit of my concerns too. But thank you so much, everybody. So thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, Planning Commission and staff. At the Wednesday meeting, May 18th, the City Council, Ona Smith of HCAOG, Humboldt County of Association Governments, delivered a presentation on REAP, Regional Early Action Planning Grants, that is funded through HDC, the California Department of Housing. City of Arcata requested $25,000 for technical assistance, specifically for public engagement on form-based codes and support. First, I would like to ask, what is the status of these funds? Conveniently, the city just released a notice. It is working hard to develop the next phase of engagements and education on form-based codes, and for the next few months, and specific schedule-related design engagements will be made available in the next few weeks. Considering the city's track record with lack of data on the January 21st, 22nd open house at the community center, and the lack of producing solar shadowing models that were both promised months ago, not to mention the study session that was requested by RGA between the City Council and Planning Commission back at the City Council goals meetings back in March. I request a clear timeline for the engagements in the community form-based code development. Form-based codes appear to be shrouded in mystery. However, form-based codes can be objective. Objectively, you can clearly define max building heights, setbacks, and stepbacks. Stepbacks should be sufficient to establish a clear corridor to maximize sun exposure on surrounding structures. Through careful planning, Arcata can best achieve net zero. And thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Diane Ryerson, resident of Arcata. This is regarding insurance underwriting. So in the future, will insurance underwriters insure construction in low elevation sites, that is, sites that are less than or equal to 10 feet above sea level in Arcata? For flood risk mapping, FEMA is conservative and uses the 1% risk of flood in 100 years. The Ocean Protection Council 2018 report has a graph that's included in the grand jury report on sea level rise. The medium to high risk, that is sea level prediction, that is used by FEMA for flood mapping, shows that for 2050, which is less than 30 years from now, sea level rise will be more than 2 feet above current levels. We have experienced king tides that raise the water level by 9 feet above sea level. So for king tide events in 2050, the flood water level will be near or higher than 11 feet above sea level now. Insurance underwriters will use these FEMA flood risk maps to make their decisions. I urge you to address this issue in the general plan update, and if the Gateway Area Plan is removed and is handled separately, please address it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone remotely? Oh, please come up.
Good evening. My name is Fred Wise. I've lived in Arcata or nearby in Jacoby Creek for over 35 years. I've been following the Gateway Plan since it was released, since the draft plan was released to the public in December. For me, there's a tremendous amount of information that's not getting out to the public. It's because it's scattered in different places. We have letters, we have the Planning Commission meetings, all sorts of information. I decided to make a website and put as much information as possible, certainly not all the information, and I'm here to announce this website. It's got documents, maps, variety of information, letters that were printed, plus a lot of commentary and opinions. They're currently my opinions, but the website is open both to the public, to David, to yourselves, anyone who wants to post on it. It does not have commentary for a variety of reasons, but there's a way of contacting me on the website, and I look forward to other postings. It's still in its infancy. I'm posting on it daily. It's a living, growing document. I don't want you to regard it as complete. I like to offer more suggestions and solutions. Right now, there's a lot of criticism because I've been dealing with history more than the future. There's a section, it's translatable into Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Dutch, Hmong, Lao, and Ukrainian. There are sections for first-time users, people who aren't familiar with the plan. There's a section for the planning commissioners and the city council members to get up to speed on things that I think are important. It's got links to different city PDF documents and so on. But I'm going to stress again that it is incomplete. It's not a finished document. It's a growing document. David has been very helpful responding to questions from me. I've talked to him about this, and I've assured him that there'll be plenty of things that he disagrees with. I think that's the nature of comments, and we seem to be good-natured about things. That's on the website. This is it's very easy to remember. It's arcata1.com, okay? And that'll get you there. There are transcripts of previous planning commission meetings or videos. I put up Jennifer Dart's excellent video from the Economic Development Committee. That's on that. I don't have the timer here, so I'll keep going. My main issue tonight that I want to present to the Planning Commission is to slow this process down. That's my opinion. I think the staff is doing an amazing job for who they are. In the process of developing websites, I've been looking at other plans in other cities. We're using Redwood City's downtown precise plan as a model of the sort. They're a very different city. They're wealthier. You can't compare them as apples and oranges. They have 16 full-time staff members for their planning department and 5 supervisory members. They have an IT department and a GIS department. They're separate. They spent 4 years developing their plan. 4 years. I think the idea that this can be completed by December is folly, to put it mildly. And I think that the city will be better served the sooner we can figure out whether we're shooting for this December or shooting for next year. The sooner it can be figured out, the easier or the more complete the path we can go on to get a productive, good plan. In closing, I'll say that I think almost everyone believes that there needs to be a plan. We have a tremendous pressure for growth here. It's not a question of needing a plan, it's a question of what the plan is going to be. I think that there's lots of good parts to the existing draft plan. I think there are a lot of parts that are unfeasible. I'd like to see us come together, and I think in closing, we all agree. We all want the best for Arcata. We all love living here. That's why I made the website. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Former Planning Commissioner. That was excellent. Do we have anyone is there anyone else do we have anyone online?
We do have one online. Go ahead, Jane.
Hi there, Jane Woodward. Nice to see you tonight. I want to reiterate, actually, I want to applaud Fred for his comments on the timeline, because I've been raising that issue. We don't seem to understand whether we can.
Sorry, Jane, will you start over again? The speaker went off.
Okay, this is Jane Woodward. I want to thank you ever so much for giving me the opportunity to speak and welcome the commissioners. You have a big task at hand, and I want to applaud Fred Weiss for what he just has accomplished, because I've spoken with him off and on, and he's been working his little butt off trying to get all this information together to give us guidance and access to the information we need to make good decisions, for you to make good decisions and the council to make good decisions. But I certainly think one priority is to not let grant deadlines determine the scope and timeline of this process. It seems to be totally unclear that the whether that timeline can be extended and what are the implications if it's not. Grant funding is generally granted. It doesn't normally have that kind of a deadline requiring action at the very end. So I think that should be checked. We need to know that, to know what our time frame is, and not to let grant funds determine a process that is going to dictate what we do for the next 20 years or so. I also want to point out, and this just as aside, when I looked at the agenda, the text under item 1 and item 2 are identical, so that somebody who doesn't know what's going on would be confused, because the text is the same under both, as well as the recommendations. I'm sure that's an error, but it's just a curiosity. We're trying to go so fast we don't have time to edit. So I just want to encourage us to tackle that issue right away, so we know what our timeline is for sure, and consider the nature of what we would forfeit, if we miss our deadline. Because this is an artificial deadline that's been created for grant funding. Grants usually don't put any requirement in for having a particular product. This is kind of unusual. And grant funds are exactly that. They're grants. They give you the money. Normally they just give you the money and they hope you'll do what they ask you to do, because you are not under contract. So I think this should be investigated and made a top priority, so you can decide how best to proceed with this and not have to rush your way through it and not get the public engagement that would be ideal. Thank you ever so much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Jane. Is there anyone else, David? No?
That's all I see right now.
Okay, so we don't normally do this, but how does the commission feel about responding to some of these questions, like the ones from Chris and the one from Patricia?
We could wait until the communications portion of the meeting, which is at the very end, or we could actually take some time to ask staff for clarification, and I would only want to do that as an agendized item if it also provides us with an opportunity to discuss these issues amongst ourselves rather than just to hear staff, which means a substantial change in our agenda for today.
Well, we wouldn't be taking action, so we wouldn't need to agendize.
No, we wouldn't need to agendize, but I'm not really happy about the idea of staff clarifying and us not getting to discuss those issues.
So do you want to put under communications?
I'm happy either way. I think it's going to be under communications regardless, but I understand that many people might not want to wait that long until the end of our meeting.
If I could offer maybe a middle path, the chair is absolutely right. During oral communications, that's an opportunity for the public to provide input into the meeting that for items that aren't on the agenda, and it's not intended to be a place for deliberations or, back and forth around specific items. Oftentimes, the council will ask staff to address something quickly if they can under that, and so that would be appropriate here if the commission wishes. The correspondence and communications, unlike the second oral communications portion for the council, it's not an opportunity for the public to come and speak again, and it's also not an opportunity to discuss things that aren't on the agenda. So both those would be Brown Act violations if we were to do that. So my middle path suggestion is that, many of these comments, despite the fact that, the oral communications is intended to be items that are not on the agenda, are tangentially related to the matter that's on the agenda. And so if you want to ask questions about things that the public requested information on during those agenda items that seem relevant and germane to you, I think that would be appropriate.
All right, so can we put a couple of these things on our agenda for next meeting? Like especially what Chris was saying, and then,
I think I can address that in the matter tonight. The questions about where the gateway plan fits within, and I have some other information that may be helpful to this once we get into the agenda item.
okay, and then Diane had insurance issues, and that's on my notes for when we get into the housing element, so I'd rather wait until that.
If we're going to be asking you to address items, I'm wondering if we could talk about the matter that Jane Woodward raised as well with regard to what exactly is the provision of the grant that is putting us into such a hurry. My understanding is that a grant can require, a draft deliverable, but cannot necessarily require a public body to vote on anything. So clarification would be great.
Okay, so all that's going to be on the agenda for next meeting then?
Well, I think we're going to discuss,
Okay, no.
or during the already agendized items tonight, this stuff overlaps enough, is
That
what
would be my
heard.
recommendation, yeah. If the planning commission's interested in that.
I am. I think we just have to make sure we tuck it in or make sure we address it as we go along.
David was already planning on addressing that particular issue, so I already know that, so. All right, so we're going to get to it. Okay, so we're going to on to the consent calendar. We haven't even got to the consent calendar yet. The only item we have is our May 10th meeting, our minutes. Does anyone need to pull that item, or can we get a motion to approve the minutes for May 10th?
I move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a first by Mayor and a second by White. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, motion carries. So tonight, we will head straight to business items. The first is to consider the draft growth management element of the soon-to-be General Plan 2045. Can we get a staff report, please?
Yeah, good evening, Chair and Commissioners. We have two items on the agenda tonight, and just to knock one of the questions off, I can't tell you why the agenda reads the exact same on both of them. Our system is designed to pull the agenda items out of, it's a computer program that we input our staff reports into, and the computer program is intended to pull certain sections of the staff report, the title, the recommendation, et cetera, the introduction, to build the agenda. I can't tell you why it happened that way because I verified when I looked at these two staff reports that they are in fact different. But you will see some similarities moving forward as we're covering similar ground. So a lot of the language is going to look the same. The particulars are going to change. And so for instance, tonight we're evaluating the growth management element revisions. The general plan has several elements in it, and we'll be looking at them in turns. And so, we'll frame these things with the same type of language, and the details is what you'll be looking for differences in. And so in tonight's discussion, we're going to cover what the growth management element is, the changes that have been made, and also put forward, recommendation for how we can cover this material as you're looking at each of the different elements. And then in addition to the table that's in both staff reports, which outlines the gateway topic, with a specific date for the Planning Commission regular meeting and the general plan topic that we intend to cover for those specific dates, which I know was something the community was concerned about, knowing when are we going to cover this material. It also includes the brief description of the growth management element. In addition to this table, we'll be bringing forward to the City Council a full staff report on milestones and updates to the timeline at their next regularly scheduled meeting. For those who are interested in that, I encourage you to attend. Okay, so before we dig into the growth management element detail, let me just give you an overview of what it is that we're doing here and how we're presenting this material. So we said at the very beginning of this process that, many of our general plan elements are already, reflect the community's value. These elements were adopted in their, largely in this form in 2000. And this was from our General Plan 2020 at the time. The community put in a significant effort to update from the 1989 General Plan, which was fairly dated, to this more modern General Plan 2020. And the effort that went into that is still valid and reflects much of what we've heard through the General Plan visioning work that we've done with the community. And so there are several elements that they fall into a couple of different buckets. Some, like the growth management element, only require a little bit of polishing. Some are going to be completely replaced, like the recreation element. You may recall that I've made the joke that it's been printed on a dot matrix printer. It's out of date. We need to replace it. And then there are others that aren't going to be wholesale replacements, but need significant work, like the land use element. So what you have in attachment A, starting on packet page 8, before you tonight is the proposed growth management element, which shows the major modifications in underscore strikeout. There's primarily underscore here, you'll see, because the first draft of this document was already pretty good. What you do not see here, and I want to emphasize that this does not reflect all of the changes, and we've got the specific documents here. If you want to go through and compare language, we can do that. Again, I know a lot of people are concerned about transparency, and I want to be perfectly clear that I did not show you a full track changes version of the changes in the growth management element. This document would be very difficult to read if you saw every single little editorial, grammatical, change that we made or change to the sentence structure to help it read a little bit better. And so what we've shown you here in these underlined strikeouts are only the major additions that we've added into this document. If the Planning Commission wants to see that more granular review, I can certainly start adding those in, but I don't intend to unless the majority of you wish to see that. Anyone who's wishing to, sleuth these out in more detail is obviously more than welcome to ask me for a copy of the track changes version. And as long as there are, there's a version available that we can share, we will be happy to do that. And obviously, you can go back and compare sentence structure if you wish with the existing document that's online. So, okay, so super high level, are there any questions about sort of how we're reviewing these and what the structure is for how staff has presented it?
In the future, I would like to see all the changes. Sorry, because I sat here and I compared exactly, and so just saying in the future, but right now I'm fine, because it's not that big of an element.
You do want to see the full track changes version?
In the future. I don't need to do it.
Can we do a straw poll, because, I just want to make sure that that's something that the full body wants to see before we
Yeah,
make that
I
call?
don't need it for this one. It's quite small. It didn't take that long, but in the future, I would,
For other elements?
yeah. It's just, I just want to see what got changed. Okay, straw poll. He asked for a straw poll.
Yeah, I'd also like to, again, this is fine, but I'd also like to see that material for the future if there's an element where there are substantial changes, but there are also little changes. Sometimes the wording of a policy is fundamental to that. The difference between can, will, and shall, for example, makes the difference between a policy with teeth and substance and one that's simply a recommendation. So we're the only folks that are probably going to be interested in seeing that level of detail. And it, especially when we're reading it with several documents in front of us.
Right.
It would be really a lot easier if you provide us with that documentation rather
Yeah.
than us sitting there with a paper and the computer and a
Absolutely,
laptop.
and I want to be clear, anything that would have that kind of a change, that would be considered a substantive change, not just like word order or, editing for clarity. We would definitely include that as a underline, but if the Planning Commission wants to see that additional detail, I'll throw the extra documents on there.
So we're still straw polling to see in the future on other elements whether or not we'd like to see the comparison of how text is changing. For that in the future.
It would help me, less work. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Less work for me, I would appreciate it.
Okay. Okay.
Sounds like majority wins.
Yep, I got my straw poll. Okay, thank you for that. And I will also attach the growth management element on the next agenda item, the full track changes version, so you can see that as well. Okay, so growth management, super high level. Basically, what the growth management element does is works in tandem with other elements that are designed to manage growth. So open space element, the conservation element, the land use element, blessings. To manage the growth within the city. What the growth management element is specifically concerned with is boundaries. And so it has policy that focuses on the different boundary layers. And so for folks, at home who are following along, if you turn to packet page 12, this graphic basically gives the best representation of what these different boundaries mean. And I'll kind of just work through them in the way that they're nested here, just so that folks can understand what we're talking about. The biggest boundary is the planning area. The planning area is a boundary that is way, way, way outside of the city limits. And essentially what a planning area is the area within which the city of Arcata wants to have some kind of influence over land use decisions. And so these are areas in the county. The county has land use decision-making authority over that. But we are essentially stating we would like you to consult with us for any projects that occur within the planning area. We don't have any kind of regulatory influence there. The sphere of influence is the boundary within which lands that may be annexed into the future. And so that's inside the planning area, but outside of the city limits. So sphere of influence is primarily designed to describe areas that may be annexed into the future. In our current general plan, we treat the sphere of influence kind of as a planning area boundary and as a sphere of influence. And so we've clarified and cleaned that language up so it's real clear that the intent of government code that regulates the local area formation commission that oversees boundaries and annexations, that we mirror and match their intent for the sphere of influence, just for clarity. And if you're interested, I can describe in a little more detail why that is and the history that led up to making that change. The next boundaries that fall within the sphere of influence that are related don't necessarily nest exactly. And so there's the urban services boundary and the city limits. Urban services boundary is the area within which we can provide sewer and water service. If you're outside the urban services boundary, you cannot hook up to city water or sewer. We do have a couple of interesting pieces where we have a water-only district and we have a sewer-only district that are in areas that are outside of the city of Arcata, in areas that we do not intend to ever annex, but that the city does provide those services. So one is like the Jacoby Creek Water District. We provide water to the Jacoby Creek District, and they then service that water out to their customers. And then nested totally within that, or the smallest layer, I guess you could say, is the city limits. City limits is our jurisdictional boundaries around which we have police power, the authority to make land use decisions. There are some areas outside of the urban services boundary that are inside the city limits. A great example are the bottomlands around Highway 101 on the south side of the city. We don't intend to provide services out there. We don't intend to see that area grow and develop and have, buildings built out there. So there's no need to serve water and sewer out there. So it's outside the urban services boundary. There are areas of the urban services boundary, obviously, that are outside the city limits as well, and I've already described that. So just real quick, the two major changes that we've made here, the first one is on page 8, where we've put a little bit more specificity around, the intent or the growth management overview, and then we also do a little bit more to describe the relationship with Cal Poly Humboldt. It was kind of given short shrift in there before, and recognizing the fact that Cal Poly is a major driver for both economic and population growth, we added a little bit of language there. And then the other major change is on page 12, starting on packet page 12, where there's some language that tries to describe relationship amongst the various elements, and then the relationship to the Office of Planning Research guidance that they provide for growth management elements. And really what this is about is to try and further clarify some of the intent behind urban growth and when we would expand and annex. And it's intended to line up a little bit with the LAFCO guiding regulation as well. There are a couple of other changes that are indicated in here, but I won't go into those in detail unless you're interested. I guess the only one that I would really want to draw your attention to in particular, but I won't go over now unless you're interested, is in Growth Management Policy GM3C. And that came out of our most recent annexation where we annexed Enos. That is on packet page 18. And then the implementation measures at the very back of the document, page 20, packet page 20, have been updated to reflect, implementation measures from last period that we've completed, and then new implementation measures that we need to complete now. As I mentioned, I do have both the growth management element as proposed here with these underlying changes, as well as the existing growth management element if there are specific questions about language changes that occurred here. And if we start getting too detailed into the weeds in terms of questions, I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm probably going to have to get back to you if you have those detailed questions, but I could talk generally about what we've done here. So that's what I have prepared. We can go over the language if you want, or answer any questions, open it to public comment.
Does anyone have any specific questions?
Hi. First, I really appreciate the additions that you've made here that really do clarify some of the concerns of Arcata uniquely and update what we're all about compared to last time. This is a general question, and then as we go on, there's some much more specific ones that I would have. The state's general plan guidelines really see a growth management element in a very, very narrow way. Arcata has already been pushing that with insisting that we address our green belt and blue belt and the ability to retain a compact sense of our city. But I'm wondering if there is any possibility of, while observing the state's guidelines on what they expect to see to enable LAFCO to do its job with our policies, if we can also really acknowledge with some additional language here and a couple of extra policies, our intention to intensify our development within the city as a means of limiting development beyond our current boundaries, and to go into some of those policies in the growth management element. This is beyond what the state's 2017 guidelines tend to see the growth management element doing, but I think it's really consistent with what Arcata intends to use it for, and specifically some language that would allow us potentially to expand some of our boundaries for land conservation purposes rather than for development, which is something that the state guidelines simply don't envision. Is that something that you and the staff and the consultants discussed, and is it something that we can actually address here? Because when I think of Arcata and growth management, that's a big part of it. And the other part of it is to somehow build in the timing of our adequate public facilities components of growth management into the specific policies within our updated element, because there really isn't anything very specific about the timing of our adequate public facilities in several of these sections where it probably needs to be.
Yeah, so a couple things there, and working backwards, I guess, in terms of the timing of, public facilities to support expansion of the city's boundaries may not, number one, I mean, we're not proposing much expansion. In fact, you'll see as the maps.
I was referring to adequate public facilities to support the intensification of uses within our boundaries as well. The idea that intensification in some areas might actually preempt remaining capacity of public facilities elsewhere.
Right, and so, yeah, I was trying to give a comprehensive answer because I think there are, a couple pieces. So the first is that, and then in terms of infrastructure internal to the city, I don't think it's appropriate to put in the growth management element in policy. I think it's totally appropriate to reference the other elements that do address, public infrastructure, and intimate that the growth management element is to work in conjunction with and be compatible with those other elements. I think that we by ultimately the elements take a portion of the different bodies of policy, and so I would be cautious in terms of trying to have too much cross linkage where you have specific policy that actually better belongs in another element. You're going to wind up creating the potential for conflict and greater potential for conflict, number one, by doing that, and number two, it makes it more difficult to manage where you go to look to address that body of policy. So I hear what you're saying in terms of making that cross linkage, and then that gets to sort of the first part of your question. Growth management element and the housing element in particular have a lot. The city of Arcata has a lot less discretion as to how it it handles the body of law. It's not as it's got other partners that actually manage certain elements of the body of policy that we're outlining in these elements. But I still think it's completely appropriate, and I think that we have done some of what you're suggesting in terms of identifying policy that goes a little bit beyond the guidelines. The guidelines aren't prescriptive. They provide sort of a baseline, and then local jurisdictions are free to adopt other policy that helps support that that underlying body of or the underlying intent. So yeah, I think it's totally appropriate to adopt additional policies in terms of actually annexing lands for conservation and preservation. The city has clearly done it before. We annexed Jacoby Creek Forest. We're in the process of annexing McDaniel Slough area. So there's no question that we have a precedent for doing it. And I think it would be appropriate to state that. We do have to counterbalance, and this could be done on the project level, not necessarily the policy level. We have to balance conservation good versus the fiscal expense, because at some point, we need to be able to manage those properties. But that could be handled on the annexation by annexation level, and then include some language as you're suggesting. And what I would offer is, I think I understand your request, and if the Planning Commission, wants to make a recommendation, again, straw poll style, make a recommendation to include that stronger language, I'd be happy to go and try and craft some and then bring that back. And then, if anybody is interested in providing insight, Vice Chair Mayor, if you wanted to, provide some insight into that, that would help kickstart us.
You have more questions? I'm going to open this up to the public too, and then I have a lot of questions too. Shall we go ahead and let the public address this, or are you on a roll?
I have big general questions. After the public, I have more specific.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so does any member of the public would like to come up and comment on the growth management element?
Sure, why not? Chris Richards here. The only question I really had, I looked over this a little bit, and I'm learning quite a bit as I go at every step, but the numbers on page 8 of the agenda packet, where you're showing 1% growth, and then the numbers through 2045, and then later you show the numbers for Cal Poly, their hopeful growth. And it appears, first of all, that 1% isn't accurate if you do the math. And then the other thing is that a majority, I would say, well more than half of the proposed growth is within a few years, 5 to 6 years at Cal Poly, and then the last 35 or 104,000 are going to be spread over the rest of the 17 years. So it appears that it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when I read through it. And maybe I tried to outguess the future, obviously is a hard thing to do, but I just feel that the way you've written that, it's quite confusing and doesn't seem accurate as far as, everything else that you've provided us with in some of the other meetings that, the predictions with growth and all that. So anyway, that was the only critique. I'm still learning about the sphere of the area and all of that, so I'm trying to figure out how that all falls play with the annexation like you were describing. Anyway, thank you for listening. Take care.
Thank you. Is there anyone remotely that, no?
There's nobody on remote, no.
Okay, so I'll close the public portion of this. So now we can ask questions. Judith, do you have more questions?
I just have a broad question. It's a little bit of a mental stretch. We've spent so much time talking about infill to suddenly be jumping to the topic of annexation and service boundaries and everything. So I'm simply questioning the timing of this. Is it have anything to do with the gateway process, or are we just cleaning up the language as we've done periodically on the 20-year plan, the general plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is kind of a jarring transition to go from talking about infill to talking about annexation. The growth management element really limits the reasons for annexation and the purpose for annexation. And if you look at our sphere of influence boundary that's changed in Figure X, and again, the black and white version is a little hard to read, but we've shrunk the sphere of influence boundary. And I'm sorry, Figure X is the urban services boundary, not the sphere of influence. But we've shrunk those boundaries relative to the boundary that's in the current General Plan 2020. Again, when General Plan 2020 was adopted, we sort of portrayed the sphere of influence as like a stronger planning boundary, that not only are these the areas that we would think to annex, but these are also the areas where we want extra say in what planning happens in them. In fact, the sphere of influence is codified in state law, and sphere of influence means the area that you want to annex, that you are planning to annex. And so if there's a property owner and they're in the sphere of influence and they come and say, well, I want to be annexed, it's a little hard for us to say, well, no, we don't want to annex all of the sphere of influence. We just want to annex a portion of it. So we have definitely emphasized the infill components, reduced the sphere of influence, made it so that the policy really does focus more intently on on those infill policies. And in fact, that big chunk of text that was included that talks about the relationship to other plans and elements doubles down on the infill. If you read each of the sub-paragraphs, A, B, and C, they all mention infill. And C sort of says that, well, okay, if you're going to annex lands, if you're not going to do infill and you're going to annex lands that are outside of the city, then you have to meet, these very specific requirements to ensure that it's efficient growth. So yeah, I agree that it seems a little jarring on the face of it, but we've really got a growth management policy that tries to emphasize infill and only limited annexation over the plan period.
And so its time just came around to clean up this language.
That's correct. Yeah, and we'll have many elements that are like this. In fact, I sort of stacked the general plan topics. If you look at the table in the staff report, tried to stack the general plan topics, the front load, the ones that are easier to update, that just need a little bit of polishing that we can bring to you more quickly. The ones that have a lot more work that need to be done on them, we need more of our consultants to, staff time, or there are studies that we need to do to really understand, what the proposal should be. We've pushed those towards the later periods.
Second question, I don't recall the numbers, but Cal Poly, I think, has projected so many beds of construction on campus, or is it just on and off campus? I don't recall. Can you share those numbers, just because I'm forgetting?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head. What I can say is that in Cal Poly's prospectus, they're planning on growth to about full-time equivalent student body of about 12,000. There are faculty and staff that come along with that. They are intending to expand their, the beds that they have that are either on or off campus, both in Arcata and outside of Arcata, McKinleyville and Eureka primarily, to house students. And I believe that it's around 3,500 beds that they're planning to build out. And so they are taking a significant, role in increasing housing for the city of Arcata for their students. And so we're taking that in consideration, absolutely. But it's still, their population still counts into our total population number. So it's a little different how you look at it from housing and population growth. And so then in terms of the growth projections, and there's a statement in here on packet page 8 that the population is going to grow about 1% year over to a maximum population of 27,000. I will double check the math. I'm pretty sure that's accurate. I've got a model that I've used to calculate this. Pretty sure it's accurate, but I will double check it. And that number may flux as well. It may fluctuate. Again, the city council is ultimately going to have to make a policy decision. You all are going to have to make a policy recommendation to the city council as to what growth we should be planning for. And the way I would look at this is that, if you plan for too low, if you plan way under, if we said, look, we don't want to see any population growth, we're just going to set our population at 20,000 for the next 20 years and that's it, which, I don't think anybody's proposing we do, but if you were to, go that low, then you would have all kinds of unintended consequences that would happen, in the housing market, to our population base. Cal Poly would probably get a lot more aggressive about buying property and ensuring that they had, property for, for their purposes, for example. You'd probably see a lot of gentrification and, that sort of thing. If you plan too high, you might open the floodgates and make it so that, there's uncontrolled growth that we can't track based on our infrastructure, needs and so on and so forth. And so really there's a number in there, sweet spot number in there that we need to be able to plan for that helps control and, moderate that growth based on our infrastructure needs, but then doesn't shoot too low so that we can make sure that we're planning for our community. So with that, the Cal Poly numbers are important. They add into these population numbers. The total population numbers are ultimately going to be adjusted based on whatever the council, and the Planning Commission recommends and the council approves. So that 1% growth, the 27,000 number is likely. It's approximately what we said we were planning for. In fact, the math in the general plan 2020 was wrong. We said 1% growth, but it didn't add up. So I guess that's what I would say, is that we might come back and revise that number based on these policy considerations.
I have a couple of little questions. So, under discussion, you said the growth management element describes the city's approach to both growth and preservation. So is this going to replace both the growth and the historical preservation element? No, just
No, and
the
by
one.
preservation, that's mostly resource conservation. So preservation of the green fields around us, the forest lands around us, the natural environment.
So, and then I also had a couple of little questions. I did like the way, it was annoying at first having to compare it with the old one, but you did rephrase so many things, so it's much more readable and understandable, so I appreciate that. I had a question, or one thing that I did like, packet page 13, under guiding principles G, you said manage the timing and amount of growth in accordance with acceptable levels of service and quality of life for existing and new residents. I love that. But I had an actual question. Where was it? Oh, okay, so on packet page 17, 1, it says initiate and city review prior to LAFCO application filing. A petition must be signed by no less than 25%. Why did you change that from 50 to 25% of registered voters rather than resident? Can you explain that, to me?
Yeah.
What the logic was behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. This policy is amended to reflect the LAFCO's charge, what they're actually, what they're required to implement. And so, if we get into a little bit of jurisdictional back and forth with this one. If we don't match with them, city can certainly say, no, we want to keep it at 50. And again, it's registered voters, it's not residents. So it's the registered voters. That's, I wouldn't recommend changing that. If we said, no, we want to keep it at 50, there's actually a process in, the legislation enacting LAFCO that allows residents to elect to annex and go to LAFCO instead of coming to the city. And so we could say we want it to be 50% all day. It really wouldn't matter, because if LAFCO is 25%, those 25% could just go straight to LAFCO and say we want to annex. So I guess my recommendation is that we match their language so that at least we're on the same, we're using the same language, and that we can still control those annexation requests.
So that whole thing, the other part that you added, so it says a petition must be signed by no less than 25% of registered voters, or at least 25% of property owners who also own 25% of the assessed value of land within the territory proposed for annexation. Is that exactly from LAFCO?
Yep.
So we don't have a choice in that?
Yeah, those are
Okay.
same policies from LAFCO, as well as the language that's added before.
Okay, and then I also didn't understand packet page 19, GM 4-BF. Why did you cross out the within 18 months from the date that sanitation sewer service was provided? Is that another law that we have to follow?
That is not, and I'm glad you brought that up. We have a little bit of experience with this one. What I will say is that from my professional experience, once someone is connected, then, they have no motivation to come in and apply for annexation. And so this is for emergency sewer connections outside the urban services boundary. You're only supposed to be connected to city sewer if you're within the city limits and you're within the urban services boundary. And so if someone's septic fails and they say, we really want to connect to you because we can't take showers, and we say, okay, but then sometime in the future, come in and apply for annexation, and they decide not to, then they don't. So what we're doing here is we're saying, you need to apply for annexation now while you're applying for your emergency sewer connection. There's still the opportunity, I'll be perfectly frank, because that's a single parcel annexation, they can still protest it when it gets to LAFCO, so they can go through the entire process and then decide not to be annexed, and I've seen that in my career as well.
Judith, do you have some questions?
Yeah, thank you. Questions, comments. First, thank you for getting rid of that 18-month thing, because I think after the debacle of the Jacoby Creek School emergency sewer connection, we probably did learn some things. So I said, yay. And now after your questions, I'm sort of reordering things that I was going to ask about. You've gotten rid of some portions of the implementation schedule, things that had already been done, which kind of highlighted for me things that maybe needed to be done. One is that when the city is asking to be consulted by the county, if the county is considering various actions that will affect the city. It also occurs to me that right now we're dealing with more than the county that the city has no jurisdiction over. We're also dealing with some major state institutions. And I think it would be, you know what I'm going to say, and you know it's not on the agenda. And you know it was supposed to be on the agenda. So I'm just going to say it. I think we need to have some language formally, strongly, and emphatically requesting that state institutions, including Cal State, Cal Poly Humboldt, submit their development plans over which the city has no jurisdiction to the city for review, and also a policy that would provide us with a formal basis to request that the university in particular enter into memoranda of understanding with the city for major projects that they might undertake that would affect the city at all, but absolutely and especially any project which would use remaining capacity of city infrastructure for the university's development purposes. And we took out some implementation measures in this draft, see page 20, with regard to MOUs with the county. And I understand that that's because that's old stuff. It was happening in year one of the old plan. I think we should really have something similar with regard to state agencies, including the Cal State University. That was one thing. I think that's language that we can easily put in, and the university can then choose to act in good faith in response to, or they can ignore, in which case we'll know that they're ignoring it. The second thing is that I think that type of language should actually be listed as a policy in each of those three boundary areas, city limits, sphere of influence, and urban services, and that it's not sufficient to have it in just one location. It seems like it's redundant, but I think it would strengthen the city's position relative to other entities. And I have some suggestions of where that language could go, which I can get to you. Another thing that was kind of interesting to me is when we're talking about the green belt and the resource protection and planning area, over the past few years, we've run into some interesting issues with regard to the definition of agriculture and things that are allowed in the agriculture exclusive zoning areas. Among other things, we've dealt with issues of agricultural processing facilities, which are in fact industrial uses with industrial styles of structures, which we've been stuck with accepting as agricultural uses acceptable in an ag-exclusive zone. And I really think the city should reinvestigate and rethink what we will consider acceptable for an ag-exclusive zone. This came up not under our purview, but with regard to the potential of major cannabis grows just outside our city limits by one of our local industries. It came up previously with Cypress Grove, where their cheese factory was acceptable as an agricultural use because our code lists agricultural processing as agriculture. So I think we really need to reconsider that, and it's coming up now because that language is used in policies GM1D, GM1E, take a look at page 15, and a few other places. So I'd like to just get that onto our agenda right now, even though that language might remain here, but what it means, I think, is something that we as a commission need to review.
Yeah, that sounds to me like something that might be better placed in the land use element.
It maybe should be placed in the land use element, but if it doesn't get into the land use element, I think we need to address it right here. And there are two places where it can be addressed. I think it can be addressed in both. If it's not going to be addressed in one, the other one, it needs to be addressed here. So that's why it's coming up today.
Okay. Did you have other comments, or?
Yeah, I probably did, but of course then there's the question of when are we going to hear what the city's planning and regulatory authority is over land that Cal Poly owns off campus, which I think had been scheduled for a number of different times, including today.
Yeah, a little off topic, but I guess I will say that, I think we've got it coming to either the next or the very next Planning Commission agenda. I have to coordinate with the my colleagues at Cal Poly. Okay, so in terms of process, there may be suggestions for amendments. Some that are going to be relatively minor, we can make on the fly. Some that are, actually affect policy. And I guess what I would suggest that you do as a body is, again, to go through and straw poll, because, we're, in order for staff to be able to manage the, the various changes, ultimately there's going to be a recommendation from the Planning Commission. So we want to make sure that, changes that you're reviewing, the effort that goes into making those changes is something that, the majority of you are going to support ultimately. And so I've got, at this point, a couple of items up for straw poll, and I'll just take them in turn. The first is to create a policy that states that we wish Cal Poly to submit their development plans to the city for its review.
I think I was referring to Cal Poly and other state agencies.
And other state agencies.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that would obviously include anyone who could grant a permit within that area as well. And it would be review in one policy and MOU in a separate policy.
Okay, MOU and a separate policy. And I want to be clear that we can absolutely make that statement. That's part of what our general plan is a statement to the world about our values. But I also want to be clear that that does not compel Cal Poly or any other state agency to do so. So just so long as we're all clear on that. So Cal Poly and other state agencies to submit development plans, and then Cal Poly to enter into an MOU for major projects with the city to do review. We do a straw poll.
I agree. I think it's very important. I know it's symbolic probably, but I would say yes. I want that put back in.
Yeah, the other state agencies part makes it a little mushier to me, just because I, think of Caltrans or a variety of state agencies. And there is a point at which you always hear from those agencies because you have to sign off on, or, clarify whether or not there's conflict or infrastructure or anything else, right? You receive the documents from those agencies. That said, I'm sure that happens in some level. This part about Cal Poly, that's the elephant in the room. They have a lot of beds to build. So I would love to know what their development plans are. And I would think for all of our planning purposes that because they will apparently be building so much that everybody wants to know, like, where's this going to happen? How are they going to pull this off in 6 years? So, yes.
Absolutely. I think that even if it's symbolic, it might get a conversation going. And without it, then there's no accountability at all. I mean, I know they don't have to, but
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to mention I'm in support of, adding these elements to this document in respects to, just determining whether or not we have a good neighbor and, whether they're going to be an active participant in our community or they're just going to be a corporation or an organization that isn't going to benefit the community. And this is an opportunity for them to show their true colors. So I'm in full agreement that we should add this to this document.
I agree too. I'm on a lot of different committees and things like that where they really want us to be team players. And it's like, well, it goes both ways. So I would just like to have it in there.
Okay. And again, this type of policy may be something that makes a little bit more sense to go in another element, because the growth management is primarily around managing borders. I can see I'll work with it. I'll see what I can get. And then the other item.
I think this is a policy that could go in more than one element. Because it's a policy that I think we have to state emphatically and redundantly if necessary.
Okay. And then the other item up for a quick straw poll is Greenbelt annexations language for conservation purposes.
Well, I'd like to see the language. I agree with the theory of it. How would it read?
Okay.
Sorry. Bad. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Did you hear that? That's what I said.
Okay, I think I got a beat on that. And did we get so we got unanimous support on that one as well?
I guess I'm not understanding. So you're saying to tighten up the language to include not just the word conservation, but other environmental applications, or?
So right now, the way the language reads in most of these sections, it really is addressing development. Growth management, addressing the city's need to expand development or to limit it. And there are a number of different places where I think that our boundaries need to take into account the city's policies and values of conservation as well. And David actually provided some examples of where we have annexed land within the community forest and the Sunnybrae Forest to support those conservation purposes. It could be that we may end up needing to consider our boundaries and the intensification or de-intensification of uses along any of our 3 different types of boundaries for conservation or environmental services purposes. And it would be great if that were explicitly stated in here, and I don't think that that's something that would contradict the state guidelines, but it's certainly something that the state guidelines haven't addressed.
So if I could draw your attention to Policy Growth Management 3C, it's on packet page 18. We made some language modifications at the bottom on Policy 6, because this is the criteria for annexation of undeveloped land areas. So you basically have in the annexation policies, undeveloped land and then developed land. For undeveloped land, there are these requirements that the only reason why you would, annex something that had story index 60 or greater was for ag exclusive purposes. I added in a couple of other purposes here that are consistent, I think, with what Commissioner Vice Chair Mayer is suggesting. And so what I would do is I would add in the GM3C some language around, the stated purpose for annexing, conservation lands or other purposes, et cetera, and then have a bullet number 7 in this policy that address those in more detail. That would be my sort of first suggestion.
David? In respects to development, it goes in hand with conservation. In respects to, with community infill, we're going to have offsets. We're going to need treatment BMPs. We're going to need all these sorts of things in relationship to offset, this infill. So in this prospectus, are we intending, as developers come in and do the community infill efforts and so forth, and they have to offset, their stormwater treatment or, some other conservation bit in relationship to impacts to wetlands, or because that's just naturally what happens with development, or impact to areas in which we have native species, so on and so forth. Would it be transferred to the community, or would it be held by the developer? And, what's the impact there in respects of items like this?
Let me make sure I understand the question correctly. When someone comes in and develops and then they impact a wetland, and then they have to do mitigation, let's say, to offset that wetland impact, does that land then come to the city, or is it held privately?
Yeah.
We don't have a policy on that necessarily. The Gateway Area Plan does have some areas identified in the plan boundary for publicly accessible private open space. because the city doesn't own land within that area, doesn't own much anyway. Most of it is rights of way. And so the only way to create a park or, a community square or those kinds of recreational amenities that aren't just trails would be to require some transfer of public egress through easements. We don't have a policy anywhere else that really identifies that. Certainly one of the objectives of the Department of Conservation grant for the Gateway Area Plan was to develop some structures for conservation easements to be implemented along with, in partnership with infill development. So that kind of gets at what you're talking about, but we don't have one writ large for the city per se.
If we're straw polling, I liked David's last suggestion, and I'm for it. Adding number 7 to GM-3C.
Could I suggest some other language to include there? As long as you're adding stuff, it might be a place to reference achieving the city's energy and climate action plan goals as well.
Okay.
All right, is that all our suggestions? Did you get enough?
I think so.
Yeah. All right, so that wasn't too bad. So, we're not done. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, as long as we're clarifying languages. In GM4B, services outside the city boundary, page 19, there's a list of emergency sanitary sewer or water connections. The city may provide an emergency sewer or water line extension when approved by LAFCO under the following conditions. And it's not clear whether the conditions are any of those conditions or all of them.
That's historically been interpreted to mean all of the conditions.
Okay, maybe just adding that one word would clarify.
Okay.
Okay, very good. So now we're going to move on to our second business item, which is to consider the Gateway Area Plan chapters on streetscape, employment, art, culture, and open space. And again, we're not voting on anything. Staff is just looking for feedback. So Director Loya, do you have a staff report on that?
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, let me cue this up here. Okay, so thank you. This agenda item before you tonight is to address the topics under the Gateway Area Plan that the chair mentioned. Employment, open space, art, and streetscapes. I have the actual policy language before you here that we can dig into in specific detail. Also wanted to give you a brief overview while we're in employment and play one of the recent presentations that my colleague and your Deputy Director of Community Development presented to the Economic Development Committee recently that addresses some of the questions and concerns that the public has had. And then we can walk through this document as necessary. So let me just start by saying, the employment section, some of these sections are really small, which is why I grouped them all together. So the employment section, the only thing I'll say about it above and beyond what's in your staff report is that, we really did try and emphasize employment that would be compatible with mixed-use development, as that's sort of the, the drive. So we can look at that specific policy language if you're interested. But let me just share this with you, and I'm hoping, I tried this once before and it didn't work. I'm hoping it'll work this time. I'm going to play a movie so you don't have to listen to me.
So we are at the junction of trails 14 and 14.
I'm sure this is a great video, but it's the wrong one. Here we go.
Hi, today I'm going to share a little bit about businesses in the Gateway area. This presentation was shared at the Economic Development Committee meeting, which actually was held on May 12th. But I think that it would be interesting. I know a lot of public members have had questions about it, so I want to go ahead and get this information out. So the topics I'm going to go over in this presentation are allowable land uses in the draft Gateway Area Plan, some business and employment data, some discussion of the business types that are currently in the Gateway area. We'll go over just briefly some retail sales tax data, just that I think will be interesting. Talk a little bit about what non-conforming means, and then go over some common questions and concerns. So the purpose of this plan is to move away from use-based zoning. Based on the current draft plan, all of the uses listed here would be allowable. And this encompasses the large majority of businesses in the Gateway area. One comment that we've received is just the concern that light industrial uses are not going to be kept in the plan and that they should be kept in the plan. And I want to point out that based on the current draft, they are allowable uses. So you can find that information in Policy Chapter 1, which is on page 43. Any new construction or expansion would need to have housing as a component in order to take advantage of the streamlining that is being allowed for in this plan. But if housing isn't a component and the use is an allowable use, there's still a process that you can go through. It's the same process, planning and design review process that currently exists. So there is a pathway there. So one of the questions that came up at a previous EDC Economic Development Committee meeting was how many businesses and jobs are in the Gateway area currently? So based on the data from the city business licenses, there are approximately 166 businesses in the Gateway, and they employ about 376 people. So the Gateway encompasses about 9% of business licenses in the city and about 4% of the total jobs. About 20% of the businesses in the Gateway do not have employees, so those would be self-employed folks. The business data that we got, so the number of businesses, that came from City Business License Database, so that's anybody with a business license is included in that, and that was from 2021. So it's a little bit behind, but still probably pretty accurate. The information on the number of jobs, we received that data from the Employment Development Department. The Employment Development Department also provided the employment density heat map. So you can see downtown is kind of the primary cluster of employers. HSU, which is the darker purple circle east of the highway, and that's our largest employer, obviously. There's also quite a few large employers up in the Valley West and Alder Grove area, so I just wanted to point that out. I mean, I know we're talking about the Gateway here and not necessarily that area, but it is interesting to see and to note that there are several pretty large employers up there as well. So Gateway area business types. This graph shows the different business types or the primary business types that are located in the Gateway area. You'll see retail is the highest with 22, and manufacturing and consulting is next. Both of those have 13. Rental is categorized as rental housing. So there's probably not a lot of jobs associated with that, maybe a property manager here and there, but that's what that is listed as because they are required to get a business license. There are 11 businesses that identify as auto repair or parts, and I know this question has come up before, but those would be allowable uses. Miscellaneous services includes things like marketing, detailing, seamstress work, graphic design, that type of thing. And then the next, which it didn't show up here on this graph, but the next one would be home occupations. So those would be a lot of the self-employed folks as well. So this this slide gives a snapshot of retail sales tax generated in the Arcata Gateway area and also the Creamery District. The Gateway area represents about 8% of our total sales tax revenue. Of course, it fluctuates depending on the quarter. But this is just some interesting information that I thought we would like to share. The numbers that you see listed for the Creamery District are also included in the Gateway area. So I just want to make that clear that those are included in the Gateway area. It's just kind of nested, and we had that broken out. So I thought it would be interesting to share kind of what the Gateway is as a whole, but also breaking out the Creamery District. So there are 5 or 6 businesses that would be considered non-conforming uses based on the current draft plan. These businesses would be allowed to continue indefinitely, rebuild if destroyed, and generally be maintained. They would lose their non-conforming status if they cease to operate for 12 months. If a structure doesn't conform to the code, but wanted to expand, they would still be able to do so by going through the planning permit process. So they just wouldn't get the streamlining that they would if they were conforming. So if it's an allowable use and they wanted to develop, they would be able to do that. They just would have to go through the planning process as it currently exists. And I really want to point that out. The purpose of the plan is not to drive out businesses and the existing investment in the area. We know that there's a lot of, fantastic businesses we don't want to lose. The purpose really is to give more flexibility and allow more uses with obviously an emphasis on housing development, because that's kind of, the goal of the plan. So there's many non-conforming uses and structures throughout the city. It's actually fairly common. One of the examples that I would point out is all the current residential uses in the Gateway area are currently legally non-conforming, and they have been for decades. So some common concerns that have come up: how many businesses and jobs are going to be lost? And the answer there is none. What uses have been identified as non-conforming? Heavy industrial and mini storage are currently the 2 uses that are identified in the plan as non-conforming. And there's approximately 5, potentially 6. The number, I have to go through this a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to point out that right now, as it stands, based on the business license info that we've got, it looks like there's 4 mini storage units and 1 lumber mill in the area. And those businesses would likely obviously become non-conforming. But that number is fluctuating a little bit. Again, we'd need to look at that and look at the exact businesses that are out there, but about 5 or 6. So another common concern that came up is, will landowners and developers be able to build in the Gateway, or are we just making a plan that only outside area large corporations and developers would be able to do? And I want to just make sure that it's really clear that the new building height minimum is 2 stories, and then the incentives start at 3 stories. And I would say most of our local developers have the capacity to develop at that height. And this is a really great question. And I think that, there's a lot of nuance to this, but what happens if a business has to be relocated because housing is being built at their current location? So first of all, a lot in this plan is focused around affordable housing. Almost all affordable housing that's developed is developed with federal or state funding to make it feasible. All of those programs require relocation assistance, both to businesses and to anyone in a home, rental house, that type of thing. So that would be required if there's state or federal funding for affordable housing, relocation and a relocation plan. Relocation assistance and a relocation plan would be required. So that's one one piece. If it's market rate housing, that is definitely different, but the city will work with businesses to try and find an appropriate place in Arcata to relocate. A couple of sites that we've already identified as potential relocation would be Happy Valley in Elder Grove, and also the Little Lake Industry site off Samoa, which the city was just awarded a cleanup grant for. And I know that that also has some potential to be a park space as well, but there are still a portion of the property that we plan to develop as far as for light industrial use. So that is the information that I've got for you today. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to answer questions, and we can put another one of these together if we need to as well. Thanks.
All right, and thank you, Deputy Director Dart. I do have the plan up here again. Touch base on employment. So there were a lot of questions around, employment that came up. The EDC recently reviewed this. So if you have questions, we could talk about that. Let's see. Next section, arts and culture. Again, the Creamery District was sort of the, the genesis in a way of the ideas around trying to create, a vibrant mixed use district. And so we really want to honor and support what is going on in the arts district. I did receive an email from a group of folks from the Creamery building, from the Creamery District rather, that had some recommendations for you in terms of things to consider for arts and culture. Looking for a confirmation that you all received the email from me. Okay, very good. And there were some recommendations in there. I won't go through them in detail here, but it will be entered into the record. What I will say is that some of the recommendations seem like very good options for including as amenities for development that comes in. One of the recommendations about creating basically an impact fee that development would have to pay into to support the arts. I would not recommend that. I would recommend that would be a great alternative for folks that are really interested in supporting the arts to pay into that as an amenity. And we can get into details why that's not recommended here. But there's kind of two things around the arts and culture. One is sort of emphasizing the physical arts and creating the vibrancy that comes along with all of that. But it also sets out a policy that's intended to ensure that artists aren't displaced, that there's actually housing for artists, for working artists that's incorporated in here. You see this in other jurisdictions where there's a old funky rundown industrial site. The artists move in, they make it cool and chic, then everybody else wants to move in, and then the artist can't afford to live there anymore. And so we want to make sure that there's some policy to support creating artist live workspace, and there's actually some models for that we've seen in other jurisdictions. In terms of open space and conservation, I'm going to give this again a little bit of light shrift, even though this is a fairly major section. We've already gone over this in pretty fine detail before, but if you have any questions about it, we can certainly go into that. The only thing I'll say about this, just to remind you of the work that we've covered before, and I did mention this earlier, is that, let me zoom in a little bit here. All of these green areas on this map that's in the art chapter, the open space chapter, are city parks, and you can see they're all outside of the district here. They are all very close to the district, so that's one of the nice things about the city. It's only 11 square miles. You can get pretty much from one end to the other, with almost any mode of transportation. And so these are close by, but we don't have a lot of amenities that are in that district. And so to resolve this, this challenge, there's this proposal here, which has some linear features. So there are areas adjacent to creeks or railroads that could create linear features. There's an area that's identified as a fairly large square that would be comparable to the city's plaza, that would be accessible to the public. It's on private space. And then everything within this red boundary here also has some requirements for publicly accessible private open space. And so as we get more into the form-based code, there could be a list of the types of amenities. The Open Space Committee reviewed this element, and they made some recommendations for ensuring that there's recommendations or requirements for, for active recreational opportunities, not just trails, not just passive opportunities, but some basketball courts, some bocce courts, I think were specifically mentioned. And so we can get into more detail on the open space if you have specific questions, but there's quite a body of policy here. Again, it's focused on environmental enhancements and, the network of active and passive recreational spaces that will be built out by the private sector and available to the public sector.
Pardon me, David. Are you expecting daylighting of creeks in that area?
We do have a couple of areas that we've identified for daylighting. Let me just zoom into this again. It's a little hard because the creek, and this isn't the greatest map. I can certainly come back and share with you with another map in higher detail. But just looking real high scale, here's, let's see, let me get oriented here. So here's Alliance, there's K Street, here's the Creamery building proper. Here's the corner that has the car wash on one side and the mini storages on the other. And then there's a little bit of creek showing right here. You may not even know it's creek because all you see is the tops of willows as you walk by here on K Street. That creek then goes under the road, pretty much cat-a-corner to does a 45 across the intersection here, runs underneath this building, well, actually underneath the sidewalk. The building is kind of built on top of what would have historically been the floodplain. It pops out a little bit right here, and then it's culverted again, and then comes and makes a pretty sharp angle, if memory serves, across 11th Street here. And then the city has done some restoration work to open up a floodplain here. Here's the Little Learners site on 11th and M. And then the creek goes into, again, basically just a ditch. It's got some 45s in here. We've got a plan for trying to create a little bit more of what you see on this end, where we'll have more of a meandering, so some stream restoration here. But a lot of this is really difficult to do much daylighting. We would have to dramatically change the built environment here to have much of an impact on daylighting. The creek continues on here. It pops out here and there on little private properties, and then ultimately comes out, through the Butcher's Slough here. So this area right here, though, has been identified as a key area where we could do daylighting on the car wash property. It's fairly simple. There's not a lot of development on top here. And so then one site-specific sort of trade-off we would make here is that, look, we're not going to count this against you. If you daylight this creek, that will be considered a public amenity. You're not going to have additional setbacks that further reduce the development potential of this site. We may even want to give them something additional as we get into detail on the form-based code about how do we incentivize this transition to happen. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of area that is, really available for doing much daylighting, again, without having, dramatic, like if we wanted to, disconnect 11th Street, disconnect, 10th Street and, pop in, maybe, demo some buildings, we could, get creative. But we haven't gone there. There are lots of opportunities for, enhancement. Elsewhere, again, on this property, there's some wetlands. There's an old log pond right here. And so, this isn't the exact boundary necessarily that we'll end up with, but the idea here is that we would have some habitat restoration go on in this area, pick up a lot of these little pocket wetlands that you see scattered throughout these sites, and try and create more of a larger, higher quality wetland complex that's integrated with trails and that sort of thing. So there's opportunities elsewhere for other habitat restoration, but not a lot for creek restoration or creek daylighting per se. Okay, moving on to streetscape. And this section is maybe of the most interest to people. Let's see, let me jump to my. Why did I jump by it? I have it bookmarked. I just don't see streetscape. Oh, nope. Design. Here we go. Design. Nope. Sorry. Pretty sure it's in here. There we go. Streetscape. Okay. Sorry about the being beflummoxed. I've got it tabbed in my book. Okay, so streetscape, the graphics here are going to be somewhat of a challenge. You do have a copy of this, or you had links to it, I guess, I should say. But I just wanted to go over a couple of different elements of the streetscape design here. And this is, in part, what I think a lot of people are a little anxious about, the fact that, we've got this sort of general high-level streetscape design. They don't, it's not very well articulated into, an overall master plan. At the policy level here, we're really just identifying some, some overall vision for what would be integrated into that more detailed form-based code. Again, the streetscape section is a really small section. It's got about 10 policies or so. And the streetscape policies are all focused on ensuring that the streetscape is human scale, that it's compatible with the street being a part of the place. Instead of having a sidewalk be viewed as, something that conveys you from one side to the other, you're actually integrated with, the design of the street. So, I just wanted to point out, some of these boxes here, they identify, some features that will happen on the sidewalks, some setbacks and these kinds of things. And we can get into these in more detail. I can tell the eyes are glazing over, so I'm going to try and be quick about it. The one thing I will say, though, is that, that's important to consume right now is that, our sidewalks in Arcata, many of them are 5 feet wide. Many of them have vegetation growing into that 5 feet, and so they're exceedingly small. Many of them have, power poles right in the middle of the sidewalk. They're not very accessible. They're not ADA friendly. You can't walk two abreast down the street. You can't pass someone on the sidewalk without having to step into the street. And so what the plan does to try and address that is sets policies like encroaching into the private, and this shows property line here. It shows the building on the property line. It's a little confusing. You have to read the box to see that the proposal is actually to have a setback from the property line into the private sphere to expand the sidewalk and or to expand other, publicly accessible spaces so that we can have wider sidewalks, that, you have more ADA accessibility, that you have more room to, put street trees in, for example, or to have, segregated raised bike walks and these kinds of things. And so, the setbacks are important here. They require, the idea is to require, and again, this gets down to the form-based code, setbacks onto the private sphere to allow for public uses. They also, this graphic shows, at the third story or at the fourth story, there'd be a setback. The form-based code can have policies that set back on the third story in certain places where it makes more sense. And so really just the idea here is to show the community, to show the policy at the policy level that we're intending to have these forms integrated with the street and the public sphere, and use these setbacks to ameliorate some of the challenges that we find ourselves in with existing 50-foot rights of way. I think I'll stop there because it has been going on for a long time, and I know many of the people here want to speak, and I'm sure that the Planning Commission has questions or comments as well.
Great, thank you. So before we open this to public hearing, does commissioners have any quick questions or comments? Okay, we will, are there any members of the public that would like to come up and speak on this?
Hello, thank you again for your work. My name is Ann King Smith. I'm confused about the process now because my understanding is that you were going to go through this, I don't know whether we call it chapter by chapter, element by element, and you dealt with mobility. And I thought according to the agenda tonight that I read, it was then going to go to streetscape, then employment, then art and culture, and then open space. That's what I read on the agenda, so I didn't think we'd get to open space. But at the beginning, as you opened the hearing, the chair announced that we're not making any decisions. And my understanding was that you've left mobility now with no discussion of the issues. Now you're going into all these other things with no discussion of the issues. So I'm confused. Are you going to make all your comments at the end? Are you going to make them as you go through? There are a lot of issues that are critical to every one of these chapters, such as, are we going to be dealing with a number of 3,500 or not? Are we going to be, what's the height we're going to be dealing with? The whole incentive process, incentivizing, that word is used all over the place. Is that something that the Planning Commission supports or not? And it has to be refined. Are we supporting it for things like EV charging station, bicycle stages, or bicycle storage, or is it only going to be a real incentive if there's something substantially located? And so I'd like some clarification on how you're going about this. Thank you very much.
Kind of unlike me to come up here unscripted, but since we are talking about streetscapes and open spaces, just wanted to put one more pitch in for considering not turning L Street into a truck route. I think, as Patricia said, I think it could make a great linear park. There are a number of pocket wetlands that David was just describing. Ones that were jetting right out between the Wing Inflatable and Tom Parrott's property. There's a long lineal ditch that actually supports a lot of frog habitat also along there that would be covered up in the process of running we'll call it a thoroughfare through there. And really, I mean, the linear park could definitely serve as just a nice space, and I think it could be more of that quaint street that would go along with the whole Creamery District and everything else to slow things down. It would also serve as a great entryway if they ever get things worked out through the courts on the Great Redwood Highway, I should say Great Redwood Trail that would be coming through and ultimately finish up in Blue Lake, and this whole Annie and Mary sections with the history of the railroad could definitely serve as a great entryway into Arcata and just usher people through as far as the economy goes and people traveling by foot and by bikes. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
I forgot to introduce myself last time. So my name's Patricia Kombianica, and I live in the Creamery District. And I look out on that bicycle path every day. I use that bicycle path every day, and I see what it's used for, and it's used for a linear park now. We do meetings there, thanks to COVID. We've done a lot of meetings on that bicycle path. I see little kids riding their tricycles. I see people walking dogs. We have a couple campers right now on the trail. And I think it's just such an asset to the city. I loved seeing that when that went in. I left McKinleyville to move to Arcata. I started in Arcata and then proceeded to move closer to Arcata and came to Arcata. And what I missed I thought I was going to miss about McKinleyville was the Hammond Trail, but it came to Arcata. So the Hammond Trail is wonderful, but that trail is just a phenomenal asset for the city. So and some of this with like bringing a park bringing parks into the gateway area and having it like be on private lands. If we get accusation over that, you know, that the rails, then it would be city property, I'm assuming. And so it would be a great city park property the city would control. And there was, you know, I still don't quite understand like who, where the liability lies if we're putting parks on private property, and, you know, and maintenance costs and that's kind of a question. So if the city had another park that they could kind of control and had jurisdiction over. So anyways, yeah, my plug is definitely because I live right on it for that linear park along L Street. But I also see what the community just loves that park as it is now, or that trail as it is now, and uses as a park. So anyways, that's my two bits. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Fred?
I'm Fred Wise. Thank you. Jennifer Dart spoke also at the presentation at the Economic Development Committee. She spoke for about 45 minutes, and it was more extensive than this 10-minute version. I've got both versions on the website. I prefer the longer version because there's just more she gives more information. You're getting to know me. I have great respect for what the city and the staff are trying to do. When I bring things up, it's not as criticism of you or them as a person. There's the process of what you're trying to do is larger, I think, than the staff can do. I just want to make that point. That said, I find the figure of 376 employees in the Gateway area to be extremely low. As an example, look where Haleiashi, the pub, North Coast Children's Services is. I think there's 150 or 200 employees on that block. I don't have any facts. It's just a suspicion. Second, saying that this represents 4% of the total jobs in Arcata sounds like it's minimizing the jobs that are in that area. I think to give an accurate figure, you should look at the jobs that people have created and look at where people have brought money into Arcata. North Coast Children's Services has a budget of over $12 million. They have over 200 employees. Okay, the employees are not all in that location. They've got 30 sites. But these are the kind of entrepreneurial activities that we're seeing. The architect, Martha Jane, local architect, gave me a quote that I won't forget. She said, most cities would give their eye teeth for what we have here. And in some ways, we're destroying it. That's a big statement. But back to the actual numbers, I think the 376 number is not valid. She makes a statement that jobs will not be caused to be lost by the city. The city will not take away jobs. I agree with that by policy, but they'll lose their jobs because of their landlords or because the buildings are removed, that sort of thing. She said that businesses can move to the industrial parks, which I'm all in favor of the industrial parks, but it still means that we'd have a new business couldn't move into the industrial park. That where once we had 2 sites, if it closes down in the Gateway area, then there's 1. There's also commuting by car. That's a small thing. Second, open space. On page 59, table 8, I would request a new distinction be made for open space, and that is of actual playground for children. Not basketball courts or bocce, not open space or walking. All those are great. Don't misunderstand me. But the area is going to have children, and there's no playgrounds. Commissioner Tagney asked about this at the February 8th meeting. That transcription is also on my website. I guess I'm plugging my website. You asked a question. Your question was not answered at that time. Playgrounds are important. Okay, so I request that that be added to that table. This question of privately owned, public accessible spaces, what I'm about to say is my opinion. It's not a fact. I think it's wishful thinking. I think the idea that a landowner is going to give up a large amount of land for a usable space is questionable. That said, it leaves it open to interpretation in the future. 5 years or 10 years from now, a different zoning administrator or community development director might have a different idea of what sort of open space that represents. It's hard to specify. I'm creating problems here. I'm not offering solutions. I recognize that. But these are things to think about. If the so-called plaza size area that's designed for where wing inflatables is, that may not become available for 50 years. We have no idea. We don't have a pulse on the future of that. It would be nice to have some kind of a plan B for what open spaces, in terms of people congregating, would be possible. Next, Streetscape. Streetscape is given 2 pages in the document. I think that's short shrift. I think Streetscape is more important, or it could. The drawing that we see here on page 92, as David pointed out, the property line is not designated correctly on the drawing. The property line should be 5 feet from the edge of the sidewalk. So and I've talked to David about this, it's an error, but it represents a setback, the width of the sidewalk. Because as he correctly said, the streets in Arcata are 50 feet wide, it wouldn't show that way. I want to say that depiction of that drawing and that error there, the draft plan is rampant with errors like that. It's very frustrating for me. I look at it, I knew it was wrong. I talked to David about it. He pointed out where it was wrong. That's very good, but it's not good for the public. That street that's shown there is not a street that exists in Arcata. Okay? In the 2 pages of the streetscape, the last box on the left there, provide sufficient on-street parking to minimize off-street parking. That phrase is in the draft a variety of times. To me, it's a platitude. The parking in the plan as it exists reduces the parking on the street. It does not preserve parking. I estimate that it'll be reduced by 25 to 40%, sizable number. There's a section in my website about that. Parking has the advantage to planners that it's quantifiable. You can count the spaces. You can sit there and count them. There are streets in the plan that go from, well, the streets in like where the Haliashi block, that area, if my memory is correct, it goes from about 24 to about 13. There's street on K Street between 9th and 10th, I think, on K Street, goes from currently 18 spaces to 2. These are real numbers. Myself, I'm not saying that we need the parking spaces. I'm not making that announcement that I think we need parking in Arcata. What I'm saying is, don't make that statement unless it can be backed up. Next item, Commissioner Tagny, you asked, I think your question was how many dorms are being built versus how many students are coming. That also is on my website. I have an article about that. The website has a search facility, so I just searched for your name, because you had asked that question in February 8th meeting. As far as I can tell, there'll be a shortage of about 2,500 to 3,000 beds in the year, 8 years from now, plus about 700 to 1,200 faculty and staff who tend to be older and perhaps have families. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Is there anyone online?
Yeah, we have a couple people online. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hey, guys. Is it working, David?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, great. All right, good. I think it's worth noting the difference between an allowable use and in real life, what is a preferable use or a more profitable use. In gentrification, it's usually more driven by profitable uses than whether or not something is allowed or not. In the process of gentrification, current users are shuffled out to create space for more profitable uses. So I urge you to take caution when you read terms like allowable or encouraging. Personally, I don't see how the program that I manage for the Northern Humboldt Union High School District can compete as far as rent with a 7-story residential tower. In that case, if we are shuffled out to behind the old flakeboard plant, the service we provide to people with developmental disabilities will truly suffer. Our proximity to Arcata High for community integration and employment opportunities is crucial to the mission of our program. Besides, even if we move out there and can totally transform our service, that will be one less space for a new Arcata business to start up or locate. So we are talking about a net loss in employment opportunities in Arcata. So that leads me to the problem presented by the Gateway Plan and projected population growth. If we're creating a plan that incentivizes residential over employment, aren't we setting up our town for some serious problems with employment and commerce and putting considerable pressure on the general fund? Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hello, commissioners. This is Lisa Brown from Arcata, and I'm actually have a question about the prior agenda item. A lot of really critical and important topics to me were brought up following the public comment period being closed. So I was unable to comment on any of those particulars. So I can write you a letter. I can speak with David, but I wanted to point this out. I think if you reviewed the meeting, you would also see that there was an awful lot that was discussed and actually decided on that wasn't brought up prior to public comment. And it was in pertaining to agricultural land and the sphere of influence. And I worked a lot on GP 2020 on those issues, and I have a lot that I wanted to provide to you. So I need to know what where I should go from here. Comment now or wait until the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And yeah, you can definitely send me additional information, and I'll be happy to forward that to the Planning Commission. And again, this is not the last time that these topics will be discussed. So, okay, I see no more hands.
Okay, so who wants to start?
I do. I think that it's compelling that we address the question about procedure and sequencing of the, as they were referenced, chapters, topics, however we want to call them. And it did strike me on that comment that, we did talk about mobility. Now we've kind of tackled, I guess, 3 or 4 kind of blended together topics. And if we're going to come back and revisit each of these, or if we're going to try to give you and hear from the public specific guidance on each of these topics, I guess I just need to be reminded where we're at with procedurally how to get through them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the other thing I wanted to reflect back on is that there were several questions that came up at the beginning of the meeting that we didn't necessarily fully address either. In terms of the process, certainly this format is designed to, give an opportunity for the public to, make comments, for the Planning Commission to make recommendations. We're also going to the various committees on these topics. If the commission wants to, hear an item, have that item come back, we can certainly bring the item back. There's, absolutely, I'm, going to just acknowledge right now that, certain things are definitely going to get lost in the shuffle. Some questions are going to get asked. We're, likely to not hit every single point. I think we're going to hit the important points. The Planning Commission is a recommending body to the City Council who ultimately adopts the general plan and would adopt any codes pursuant thereto. In terms of where the Gateway Area Plan fits within that, it's always been the plan to have the Gateway Area Plan be an element of the general plan. And so that is still the plan, that it would be part of the general plan. The general plan is being evaluated, including the Gateway Area Plan, as well as the, the zoning code amendments, proposed land use amendments, is all being evaluated under a single EIR. It's one project description. We can't parse it out. We have that would be considered piecemealing under CEQA. And so we're taking one environmental analysis on all of the known proposed changes as they make their way through this public hearing process. And then I anticipate that the implementing zoning ordinances, the implementing regulations will be adopted, over time, over the course of the next, year or so. Once we've gone through the initial legwork to get the policy, the body of policy in place. And so, so what is the process? The process is absolutely up to the Planning Commission and the City Council. If you want to go back and review things, policies that you've already reviewed, that's your prerogative. We haven't addressed some of the timing questions, and what I will say is that, we'll be discussing those in more detail at the upcoming City Council meeting. I have a whole staff report that I'll prepare for the City Council that talks about the timelines, the milestones, what we are required to meet and what we're not required to meet. I can give you a thumbnail sketch of it right now, which probably will not be very satisfying, but I will do so anyway because the question was asked, and this is one of the things that we were saying we would address. In general, there's a couple of different things that are motivating this work right now and motivating the timeline. It's true we do have some grant resources. The question was raised, can we extend these? And I committed to going back and speaking with our funders to find out what their requirements were. And it's a mixed bag. The Department of Conservation, which gave us a SALC grant, Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Grant, said that, they would be flexible with us. If we were far enough along in the planning process, they would look at that as sufficient progress to have met their requirements. There are other funding sources that are funding this, like the SB2 funds that we applied for through the state, which are not so flexible. In fact, it's rather complex. I'm not going to get into the detail now, but there are pieces that are regulated according to HCD, and there are pieces that are regulated according to the Department of Finance. And so I don't have a clear answer from Department of Finance whether or not they're going to extend those or not. But those funds need to be spent by the end of this fiscal year. So we're working diligently to spend those funds by the rest of the fiscal year. And the performance date was extended out to the end of this year. And so my hope is that we will have made sufficient progress by the end of this year that we can say with a straight face that yes, we've accomplished the goals of this grant. That's uncertain to me now. The goals of the grant and the various grants included the EIR, the Gateway Area Plan, and the general plan updates and the form-based code. So that's the funding piece of it. Some funders are looking at this and saying, yes, we can probably extend. Some funders are saying, no, it's a hard and fast deadline. We don't have clarity yet on whether or not we would have to pay those funds back, but typically if you don't meet performance standards, you have to pay those funds back. The other thing that's motivating this is more tied to state law and housing element law. The housing element was certified by the state. It's the only element of the general plan that's required to be certified. If you don't have certification, there are other penalties that I'll go into again in more detail when I provide the full staff report. But our timeline for meeting these rezone objectives that were included in our certified housing element were through 2023. So we had to have the rezones complete by 2023. And so that's another thing that's motivating this timeline. And then lastly...
Is that end of 2023 or beginning?
Beginning of 2023, end of 2022. The last thing that is motivating this timeline is, the fact that we have been working on it for 5 years. I recognize that not everyone has tuned into it for the entire 5-year period that we've been talking about this, but this has literally been the topic of every city council, planning commission, joint study session that you've had for the last 5 years. It's been the topic. Occasionally we've sprinkled in the local coastal program and sea level rise, but this has been discussed at every single one of those meetings. We've had consistent direction from, the planning commission, the city council to continue on this pathway, since that time frame. The interim milestones that we've met prosecuting this work has been the infill market study, which was adopted in early 2020, and the housing element, which was adopted end of 2019. And so we are on a long-range planning pathway, which has many elements to it, all of which fall underneath this term, the Strategic Infill Redevelopment Program, which we've been discussing for years. It's certainly the Planning Commission and the City Council's prerogative as to the speed with which we execute this work. The level of detail that you wish to go into in order to, ensure that you feel like you've got robust public engagement. Strongly encourage folks to look through the staff reports that document the public engagement that we've done to date, not only on the Gateway Plan, but on this overall effort, because it's been hundreds of hours. It's been hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's been tens of meetings. It's been thousands of points of contact. And so I understand, in particular, if you learned about this December of last year when we released this document, that there's something going on. I understand your hesitancy to think that, something pretty dramatic has happened and staff has, pulled this out from nowhere. But the reality is that we have been working on this for 5 years with consistent direction. And so why are we planning on, wrapping it up by the end of 2022? Because that's been the direction to date. And so, the Planning Commission, the City Council will make those decisions, based on understanding of the potential repercussions and the consequences of not acting quicker. But it's certainly within your prerogative. As to the timeline that I'm working off of, this is the timeline that was established for me. I'm not pushing this process. My department is not pushing this process. We're operating on the timeline that's been set by you, the decision makers. And I think it's important to recognize that. So in terms of process, you as a recommending body are moving through this material. We have committees that are moving through this material. Each of the committees is taking up different sections that are relevant to the work that they do. They're making recommendations. We're getting recommendations from the public. We're getting recommendations from agencies and organizations that are interested in specific elements of the work that we're doing. We're compiling all that information together in an engagement report, and ultimately we'll provide that to the council with a final set of recommendations as to what staff believes should be included in the plan, identifying specifically recommendations that may have come through this process that were excluded from that recommendation, the reasons why. And then ultimately the Planning Commission will make its final recommendation up to the City Council, who will then take all that into consideration before they make their decisions. It is a lot of work. It's there's a lot of energy that's gone into it. There's a lot of energy that still needs to go into it. And really appreciate the input that, folks who are taking such a close look at it are providing. There were a couple of other questions, if you had specific ones you wanted me to answer that came up early on, but I think I've hit most of the higher level ones.
Well, David, I would like to make a recommendation. First off, we need to finish what we're doing, but I would like it if we could change our schedule a little bit, and perhaps at the next meeting, if you're able to, maybe you could bring back the mobility and these two sections that we just went over, along with our recommendations, so we can give them a once-over at our next meeting, make sure they're what we talked about before moving on. And then we need to look at them one more time, because the mobility just sort of just stopped all of a sudden, and I would like to look at it again. And then we also need to really plan out our next meetings. Summer's coming up. The housing issue, the housing element is the one I think is the hot button issue, and design. And I think we need to make sure that we're all here for those meetings. So maybe that's something else we could do. But if you're able to come back at our next meeting, I don't know how everybody else feels about that, and we can just go over those three elements and this one that we're going to finish tonight, I hope, and just look them over one more time. What do you think, Dan?
Well, if we go back to mobility, it feels like it should be a brief once-over to remind us where we're.
Right.
I don't know that we got closure, but maybe I'm just forgetting. Pardon me. But the the bigger part of what I wanted to say there was Streetscape feels like it's a giant thing that none of us quite can conceptualize yet. That graphic, despite its challenges, was even helpful, like, oh, okay, we could step it back. The sooner we start to get into that, I think that we're all going to feel a little bit more comfortable with, how we are included in this process of design. And I see that we have 3 meetings on design, and I don't know how they're different from Streetscape. It feels like this is really a looming, very big.
Do we need to continue it then?
Yeah, I think Streetscape is we just barely began that conversation. I'm sure we all agree. Anyway, this is going to take a lot of meetings and a lot of time. I mean, that's what we're getting at. And a lot of just back and forth and hearing from the public and hopefully architects and, resources of our community. And then I guess what we all need to get clear on, and I feel remiss for not recalling where we ended mobility, but did we do a straw poll? Did we all agree to something? I just don't know. And if that's the way we need to finish each topic, then let's come up with some format and decide as a group, what is it we're doing each time before we move on.
The mobility section did end kind of abruptly. I think it was getting late, and as I recall, the chair decided the meeting was over. We can certainly bring any of the elements back, and I think, we're in this review process. Generally it's, it's sort of the umbrella is the gateway plan. We're covering these different topics, but there's no reason why you can't, if you find something, during the intervening period between meetings that you wanted to mention about the last meeting, bring that forward. I mean, we're in the review process now, so.
So maybe we should have Streetscape come back next meeting along with, if you're able to, I know I don't know how you're getting all this work done.
I can bring the mobility section back, absolutely. We're planning on bringing infrastructure forward at the next meeting.
Okay,
and then. And I think that between the Streetscape and the mobility section, wrapping those up, I think there'll still be time for infrastructure. And we've got Natra and Emily, I believe, are planning on attending that meeting as well. So there'll be additional technical detail available to you as well as the policy level.
So you think we'll have time to do all of that in one meeting?
I don't have anything to present on the mobility. I mean, I've gone through the mobility section over the course of 2 meetings. If you have specific questions about it, I'd be happy to answer.
And then you're also going to bring back, which we haven't finished yet, these 2 elements that we're talking about. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm listening to what Ann King Smith was saying, and I agree that and with Dan, that figuring out a format for how we're going to consider each of these elements is really important, that we can't go forward without it. There's some really basic format things that I think the commission should decide. This might be the evening when we decide those things, or options that we can propose for next time. I do think that one of the purposes of having scheduled specific topics with specific meetings is so that we could discuss the details, and if there are questions about things that should change from the draft that we're reviewing, that's the time when we should identify those things, discuss them, and if not actually vote on a decision, certainly highlight the things that we're concerned about, and that we should do those in a way that the public can anticipate so that they can have input on them at that moment. The fact that we're not receiving messages from the public as they're being submitted to staff it complicates things a little bit. And I appreciate all the messages that we've gotten this time. Some other timing clarifications that I'd really appreciate is that, there are a number of sections that we simply can't make sense of without at least some discussion and proposals for the form-based code associated with them. Streetscape is one of those. And I think that if we are going to commit to reviewing in detail the draft plan elements that are before us, to do that without proposals about the form-based code that would implement them would not mean a whole lot. And perhaps it's an opportunity for us to suggest what that code should contain if staff doesn't have a draft of code language to present to us. And I think that suggesting what we would like to see, asking the public to suggest what they would like to see at that time, could be the only way that we can really address this issue without having draft code language before us. There was one member of the public who said that she had received some notification that the Gateway EIR and the General Plan EIR had been split. Is that correct? Because I didn't receive anything indicating that.
I'm not familiar with the comment that you're referring to, but no,
Okay,
they're being covered under the same EIR.
Okay, that was my impression. But I am wondering if at the time when the schedule on our packet today indicates design for 3 sessions, if that is the time when the details of the form-based code would be available and available for us to discuss. What was your vision for what those design sessions would be?
Yeah, my hope is that, at that point, we will be in the middle of doing some community design work outside of the Planning Commission. And so, through stakeholder engagements and a couple of other sort of dispersed format, YouTube with survey that we're hoping to work on, and that we'd be able to bring that in connection with the design element within the Gateway, start to bring some of that information back. I feel like the design is one of the, which includes building height, is one of the topics that's generated the most interest, out there in the community. And so I think that, we're going to need to take several meetings to work through that material. And I think we could link that back to Streetscape, and I fully recognize I ran out of time to present a staff report, and we ran out of time to discuss it. So this absolutely needs to come back, probably in partnership with that design. I cannot commit at this point to having a form-based code. or to having any components of that. Frankly, the direction that we've received to date is to, to create a form-based code. But due to the public discourse and some of the comments that are being made, I think it's wise for us to, ensure that we, the Planning Commission has a strong recommendation that we, move forward with the form-based code, understanding exactly what those elements are, and that we have the backing of the City Council. The City Council wants to move forward with the form-based code, understanding what the parameters are, before, throwing good money after bad, perhaps going down the route of a form-based code, and then realizing, well, actually, this jurisdiction isn't really ready for one, or doesn't want one, or whatever the case may be. But I do think that many of the, policies that would inform that form-based code, are still, valuable to talk about. There are many elements, or there are many policies that we talked about today that we don't have real site-specific detail on how we would implement them, but it's still a valuable conversation. In the same way, the elements around, the form-based code and whether we want setbacks from the street, from the property line rather, how we want to have, the parking arranged, whether we want we want to emphasize parking, or if we want to emphasize, the bulb outs that create pedestrian safety. All of those things are very relevant at the policy level, even if we don't have a form-based code, which would get down into, more detail about how to actually implement that. So I would encourage the Planning Commission to continue to have that conversation, even despite the fact that you don't have the form-based code before you.
If we have that discussion, I would strongly suggest that it be in the form of suggesting what the form-based code must include, because without that, we're having a pretty meaningful discussion. I don't quite understand why this community-based design needs to take place separately from what the Planning Commission is doing. There needs to be a way to bring the Planning Commission process and whatever community-based design process is going on together, rather than to separate them. And if that means reformatting how we're considering the design aspects of this proposed plan, I think that we'll need to do that. And the idea that an informal process outside of this formal process would somehow come up with proposals that we would simply then be responsible for reviewing, I think is unrealistic. And I think that all of us would appreciate being involved in the process of formulating design principles and whatever else is going in there. We probably should also be involved in explaining what we would like to see in a community-based design process so that it would be meaningful to the Planning Commission and the City Council later on going forward, especially if this is going to be an implementing plan that would have legal force, and that we would then be responsible for helping to apply. And I do understand that the idea, the ideal form-based code might be one in which little Planning Commission discretion would be involved. But to the extent that any ministerial approvals would come out of that form-based code, I think that the Planning Commission needs to be heavily involved in making the policies, which we will then entrust to staff to implement. Without that, I'm not willing to say that we should give up any of the responsibility for case-by-case review of projects.
I agree. So how do we want to proceed on this? Do we feel like we can at least finish looking at making our recommendations for arts and culture, open space, and conservation tonight.
Is the Open Space Committee drilling down on Gateway project?
Yeah, they've seen it twice, and I believe they've asked to see it one more time.
And might some of their ideas come forward to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I've conveyed at a high level some of the things that came out. The process, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different meetings happening sort of simultaneously. And so there's going to be no way for us to convey all of the information while we're in the process. Ultimately, we're taking all of the information and compiling it into an engagement report that'll be available before you make your ultimate recommendation to the City Council. And so certainly you'll see in that engagement report and the accompanying staff report, here's a recommendation that came from this source. City staff recommends you don't do it because of this reason. Here's a recommendation that came from this source. City staff recommends you do it because of this reason. Ultimately, the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to the City Council based on all of that information. City Council will then be able to, make the final decision. So yeah, and we can absolutely bring mobility back. You can, formalize on some of your recommendations now. I mean, I feel like we covered the growth management element. We covered, if there's anything more to say on employment.
So, for example, if we're going to go back to mobility at the next meeting, might we decide as a group that when we're done with mobility, there's some kind of recognizable, distinct done? What are we forwarding as a group or buying, suggesting to the City Council, to the city staff? I don't know. This is, I know we're having a circular conversation here, but
yeah, and I think the circular conversation could go on and on, but I think what we can continue to do is to continue to incorporate thoughts and ideas. We'll come back and formally look at mobility, for example, next time to close out that topic. You'll make some recommendations. You'll do the straw poll vote so that we'll know that there's general support there. Ultimately, that'll go into a list. You'll see the modification, proposed modification, go into a list of look, we recommend that you make these changes. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll have more conversation about it. Maybe there'll be some additional conversation, but ultimately there'll be a recommendation that you will see with all of those changes before you make your final actual vote recommendation to the City Council. Hey, we think you should adopt this thing in this current format based on what you see in this engagement report.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so do you have any comments about the arts and culture and open space and conservation?
Are we starting with the employment?
Employment, I'm sorry. Yes, we're starting with the employment.
I have some comments as usual. Does someone else want to start this? Unemployment?
Well, I just don't know how far we can go tonight to
Okay, so
consider that.
Do we want to table specific comments on employment, art and culture and open space, as well as mobility until our next meeting? It's 20 minutes to 9.
I feel like we need to, yes. I know we're feeling very incomplete and like we didn't get enough done or something, and I have very little to say about some of these topics, but maybe we just need to come back and at least touch on each of them and decide, are we moving on or not, as a group? Are we done? Have we heard from the public? Have the right people from the public come forward on each of these topics so that we know we heard them, they had their opportunity? Right? And then we straw poll or whatever we're going to do to suggest something to staff or not. I don't know. I don't have a lot to say about the arts. I imagine they're going to happen. I think great things will happen. I don't know that I need to talk about it as a separate planning commission meeting item, but I don't know if others do, if it's I'm missing something. I just want us to be as efficient and, kind of mechanical through this process. I think we all want it, right? Sorry, I don't have the right suggestion.
Are there any other comments? Do we want to table this until next meeting?
I'd like either to go systematically through the things that were on our agenda for today now, which probably means we'll be here till about 10, or table it for the next meeting and address infrastructure in possibly the next meeting and the subsequent meeting, because there's no way we're going to get done with infrastructure and this stuff in one meeting.
I agree.
And it might make sense to have some sustained discussion about our process as well in our next meeting, including the idea of addressing specific topics and actually getting yes, no, maybe, or work on that from the Planning Commission on those where we have concerns above and beyond the draft that staff has presented us. I don't know that we want to have even that discussion tonight at this point, just starting out without having prepared suggestions.
I agree. I'll work with Director Loya on getting more organized for these meetings so we can get through this. All right, so we're tabling that. So we're done. We're going to move on to correspondence and communications. What?
Just one question. If we do have specific comments that we want to bring back to our meeting next time, is that something that we can submit in the meantime so that we can all look at them before we come to sit down here? Or is that something we should just bring back verbally?
Are you asking me or are you asking the chair?
I'm asking you and other commissioners.
I don't, they wouldn't be in public, so we wouldn't.
They would be in public because they would be submitted to staff and staff would include them in our packet for next time.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. Yeah, if you have specific recommendations. And there are a couple things that we talked about tonight. There are, clearly there's some typos in the document, for example. If you want to tell me about a typo, we'll okay, yeah. We've got a very skilled technical editor working through some of those things. But yeah, send them to me. There may be things that, I'll just bring back a draft, some draft language. Commissioner Barstow pointed out that in the growth management element, for example, one of the sentences was very long and convoluted, great government speak. So, I'm working on a redraft of that. And so they're simple little things that we don't need to take a whole lot of time to, to cover, that we can, just make quick amendments and then, verify like, okay, yeah, that looks like a good change. But yeah, if you submit them to me, I will put them in the packet going forward. And again, a reminder to the public, if you submit your comments on the Thursday before the meeting or earlier, you'll see those comments included in the packet. If you submit them after that point, we'll forward them on and then incorporate them after into the packet. I have been forwarding on, comments that are clearly addressed to the commission to each of your emails, and we are still just to report out on the email task. We're still trying to get that together at the staff level, and I hope to, have a conclusion for you soon by next meeting, let's say, is my target date.
Sorry, brief comment. I just wanted to clarify that what I heard is that our chair is going to meet with Mr. Loya to resolve how we're going to chew through each of these topics and feel complete. Mm-hmm. Can we begin our next meeting as soon as we talk Gateway with that report, with what you guys came up with? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Any other comments before we move on? You're not allowed any more comments. Okay, so correspondence and communications, do we have any?
Go ahead, Joe.
I just want to announce, of course, that if you haven't heard, it's a kinetic weekend after a little bit of a pause. So come out and support all those artisans and people putting together some great engineering products and stuff like that. It'll be at the Arcata Plaza at noon will be when they take off, so you can come and see all the pageantry before.
Great. Also, don't forget that some of these questions we want to identize, I can't even say it now, I'm so tired, in the beginning of the meeting, under Chris Richards had some questions, and Patricia, I forget her last name, she had some questions too. They were really important questions, and I think that maybe we could address those at our next meeting if you have time.
Yeah, sure. Excuse me, and I'll update our frequently asked questions with the answers to those as well. And I did try and address some of what came up in the course, but yeah.
And then also, we really need to know everyone's vacation schedule. We don't want to be talking about any really, really important things when half the people are not here. So maybe you could send an email. We don't have to do that in public, but actually we don't want to do that in public. Just send an email and ask us what our plans are for the summer, and so that we can schedule.
And that's considering a Zoom option, true. I mean, if
Sure.
you're Zoomable,
Oh, of course, yeah.
join right in, right, Christian?
And we're going to have the Cal Poly off-campus discussion at some point?
Yeah, my hope is either the first or second meeting in July. It's kind of dependent on the schedules. My colleagues over at Cal Poly, I want to make sure that we can present together, that you can hear from them directly, and that I give my presentation as well. I did want to point out too that the City Council has set a joint study session for this topic for the Gateway for July 14th. Let me just double check that.
Is that going to be televised and the public's going to be able to come in? Or is it just us?
It'll be, I mean, unless things change drastically, it'll be a mixed meeting format like this one is.
Okay.
The 12th, I'm sorry, it's Tuesday the 12th. Okay, we're gonna double check. I'm getting some information from the IT guy that maybe that isn't set 100%. So we'll be having a study session coming up soon, hopefully in July. And then the City Council, I mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to bring it home. The City Council is going to be evaluating the timeline and milestones. We'll be talking about the work that you all are doing, as well as other things that we're doing in the community at the meeting on June 1st.
Could I ask a quick question?
What was that?
I guess maybe I missed it, but I was just trying to find out, what did we find out about the HCOG grant for developing the form-based codes, the $25,000? What's happening with that?
That is, so the HCOG is managing some state money.
Right.
That the jurisdictions have been able to request, funds to help support planning work that will advance development of housing. And so, there was a range of different projects. If you look at the last City Council meeting.
Right, I was there.
Okay, yeah, and I'm providing a little bit of context for the public who may not necessarily know as much as you do. So if they go back to the last City Council meeting, they'll be able to see a broader description of what those funds are being used for. The city did ask for access to $25,000 to continue the gateway and general plan, like just the whole package, the strategic infill redevelopment plan. Those haven't been awarded yet. It's still on the table. They're still in discussions. with ultimately what, what those awards are going to be. But it looks likely. The funds aren't over allocated. The jurisdictions have been, very tentative about what they've requested. So those REAP funds are probably going to come through.
Thank you. And just one more quick question. I know it's not germane to what we're talking about, but did we ever find any updates about the homeless supported housing in Valley West and what they're doing with regards to trying to prioritize the folks that live in Arcata and Valley West?
Yeah, again, I don't have an update for you on that at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other comments, or shall I adjourn the meeting?
Please.
Okay, this meeting is adjourned.